and Hegerl for these talks. And thank you for joining us, Dr. Keith. Dr. Keith is a professor of applied physics and public policy at Harvard and joins us today. A question first for Sila. You have said several times that knowledge and awareness of climate change and its impacts are often siloed. What suggestions do you have for our individuals here who might be working in specific fields or occupations about how to connect what they are doing with the work of others?
I think the biggest problems that we're facing is that we do tend to silo. Our systems everywhere are based on siloing issues. Universities do the same. Politics are the same. And separating issues is not the way to understand the whole in that way. And so I would say learn from those who are still living in that holistic way. If you're interested in working on issues of climate change on the Arctic, for example, learn from the people on the ground. And learn, because when we were going through the work of the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, where even scientists were a little bit cautious or leery about working with hunters and elders on the ground, thinking, maybe I don't know if we need to learn more. Do we have more to learn from these people? But when they got to the ground and into the communities to work on these issues, they were quite surprised, pleasantly so, that they learned a lot more than they thought they knew from the people on the ground. We may not be accredited scientists, but we certainly are scientists in our own right, with the fact that we know so well the systems around us, the nature around us. And that's what I meant earlier by saying that we can contribute to the dialogue in powerful ways, and that scientists can learn from us as well. And so it's to learn together in partnership with those that are on the ground, because Indigenous knowledge is very powerful. It's very real. It's not anecdotal. It's really learning from the ground, and it's knowing how systems work around us. Otherwise, we would not have survived a week in the kind of environments that we live in, much less survive and thrive in those environments. So it's to learn from the people on the ground and work in partnership with.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me ask a question of Dr. Hegerl and then open it up to the panelists for questions or comments you have. So modelers have these sophisticated climate models now that can do so well at predicting both the past and future climate. Can modelers now retire? Are you done with your work? What are the leading edges of research? What are the big questions out there that modelers are working on?
So we would like to predict a bit. So there is this gap in our. So we can predict the weather because we start with exactly where we are and run forward. We can predict climate by not attempting to predict the weather, but just say the mean state, the mean climate will change. But we can actually. There's this gap in between what happens next week and what happens in 20 years, where we have a combination of knowledge from where we stand and where we're going, and what the factors are that influence climate. So I think we will get a bit better at knowing if the next winter, for example, is going to be one of the wet, windy ones or one of the ones with lots of snowstorms. But understanding how climate change will impact us, how it will affect extreme events, is still, we have to do a lot. We're still not confident how hurricanes will change, and I think there is a lot of movement on that area, and the people working in it are getting more confident that the strongest ones are getting stronger. The models don't do the heat waves quite right, even something as simple as a heat wave. We worry that climate change disrupts the major weather patterns, and that is something that our models are terrible at right now. So we really want to, they do the weather patterns where they are, but they don't very well change them. So we see in the data that they have changed a bit over time, and the models don't want to change them as much. So that's a huge a huge frontier. So if you have, for example, in Wisconsin, I'm an idiot, in Minnesota, if you have your snowstorms will depend on if you have more westerly wind or not so much westerly wind, and if climate change messes with that, that is something that really affects how climate change affects you. So we need to do much more to understand that better. I wanted to connect to Sila's indigenous knowledge. We use in our data in the moment knowledge, old diaries from monks and stuff, and I think it would be really fascinating if we could add the knowledge from the Arctic that comes from the long term, from the memory that that your people have. So I hope that this is an area that develops well.
Mike, could I about predictability, because very often we hear talk or climate change is making the climate less predictable, the weather is less predictable. I mean, Sheila made that observation as well. And yet, on the other hand, scientists and climate modelers are aiming for greater predictability, more skill, either in short-term weather or in decadal climates. So I just wonder how do you sort of tie those two perspectives up? Is climate and weather becoming less predictable, or are scientists being able to make the weather and the climate more predictable?
So maybe if both things happen,
and I wonder whether it's predictability or variability. Sometimes people use variability when actually they talk about predictability when actually they mean variability.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly the issue is, and it's one of these uncertain things that we really don't know enough about, is to what extent, for example, the retreat of the ice in the Arctic changes our weather patterns. That is something that we debate about furiously. Some people argue strongly that they will make the weather more variable and that they will lead to more winter storms, less westerly circulation and more kind of meandering and more colder outbreaks. And other people argue that the evidence in the observations is not so clear, and we don't understand it enough. So I'm personally sitting firmly on the fence on this one, but it's definitely a possibility. But you're right, it's variability, not predictability.
So climate can become more variable, but nevertheless we can still predict
We can still try to predict it better, but it's going to be a challenge. We can do maybe 1 year ahead. We can say there is some climate centers that can now say the next winter we are going to get somewhat more westerly, straightforward, wet and windy winter, or we get a tendency for a cold and a very cold and sunny winter. But that's just on the cusp, and it just goes for 1 year, and maybe if you're super lucky too. But
Dr. Liverman.
Yes, I have a comment and a question for Sila. I found your talk very moving. And firstly, it reminded me that when I talked about people moving out of poverty over the last 25 years, I should have given that more historical context, because many of those people were forced into poverty by colonialism and dispossession and trauma. So in some ways, we're bringing them back into a better life. But my question is about the risk of the recolonization of the Arctic because of the power interests in the opening up of the ice and trade routes, the opening up of mining opportunities as the ice melts. And I'm wondering how one can respond to now a new set of, well, not always new, but a re-interest in the Arctic as a place for resource exploitation and trade.
Are you looking at me?
Yeah.
Okay. You look like you're looking over here.
No, I can't.
We talk about these issues a lot, and our leaders are certainly in the game of, working with our governments and working with others, and we can see what's coming down the road. We have been signaling this for the last 20 years or so. The Northwest Passage that's going to open up. to benefit the global markets once again, because it always comes back down to that. I mean, the history of Inuit goes way back. I didn't even mention that in my talk today, but I do briefly touch upon it in the book, where we were hunters first and foremost, providing for our children and our families in the 40s or even the 30s, when the global market for fur came into play, and we became trappers to meet global markets. We were not trappers per se. We would trap for our own clothing. But then we started to feed the global markets, and the same thing happened with whales and so on and so forth. And so there's been that whole history with the Arctic, and how do we grapple with the world coming onto us so quickly and us having to play these roles. So we have been signaling that, and we've been saying caution to the wind, because the Northwest Passage is considered, we say it's ours, it's Canadian. Inuit Canadian have been up there for forever, hunting, fishing, living there. Of course, America says, no, it's international water. So all of those things are happening. And we also know that with the melt of the ice, the accessibility to the resources, the rich resources that lie beneath that ice, is something that we have now an influx of mining companies, exploration companies, oil and gas exploration that's going up there in more numbers than we've ever seen because of that. So we know that there are things coming down the road. But the issue here is, for us as a people, is number one, what are the benefits to something like this? I guess you can kind of see it like a cancer. If it's coming in, let's try to make it as benign as possible. And how do we do that? How do we get the people on board that are going to be, given the jobs and the training? And is it going to be long-lasting and sustainable? And is it going to leave us as least amount of footprint as possible? Are those things possible? We ask about that because we're not sure. But that seems to be the only carrot that's being dangled in front of us right now. And of course, when people are poor and have no jobs, they're going to go for that carrot that's being dangled in front of them. And so what we've been thinking about and doing, and that's really new in terms of what's happened recently, and yes, maybe it's a campaign promise because we're up for elections in a couple of weeks, but what's happening here is that we have been talking about there are surely other ways in which the Arctic can rise and be innovative and be respectful of the land. Because believe me, when the hunters and the people who go and work for those mining companies who have held the land sacred, it's innate, it's in our genetic coding, it's who we are, it's in our DNA, to feel that connection to the land and keep it sacred. So imagine what the men come back home at the end of the day when they have dug up the very ground that they have held sacred for so long. It just doesn't seem to work, and the culture of mining is also extremely not a good place. And so we have been thinking a lot, and I remember when I was working on the issues of the Royal Commission, way back when Canada had the Royal Commission for Indigenous Peoples, met a professor, in fact, here in the US, Richard Colt from Harvard University, who'd been studying reservations, Indian reservations here, First Nations reservations, and wondered what was working, even if they had resources around them. What was working, what was not, what made it work, And so to make a long story short, and very short about what he said, because you can Google that and look it up, Joseph Colt, not Richard Colt. And one of them was, if the reservations, the Indian tribes had a governance system that was indigenous. That was number one, that made it quite successful. The other was that if it was a culture match initiative, then it worked very well. And we've been thinking about these things for a long time. And recently, what we're doing now, and if you Google this, because everything's about Google today, you can look it up and know that it's true. There was an announcement made a couple of months ago. Well, not all, everything's true. I'm not suggesting that. But if you Google and look up the negotiations that were done recently with a Baffin Island in Nunavut, who negotiated with the federal government of Canada on conservation economies, meaning hunters who know what they're doing, who know the land, who don't necessarily have to be trained for years to protect the very land and be paid for it. And so there was that recent agreement that was made in our country, and I feel that's the way that we can bring back that sense of dignity and pride in doing something that you know by protecting what you love. And that's conservation economies. And that's what we're working towards now. And that's a great example that has just been recently negotiated with the government of Canada, in Canada itself. So I don't know if that directly answers some of your questions, but why wouldn't it be that way? Why wouldn't the people that are most negatively impacted by that now come in with that kind of wisdom and be protecting the land and be paid for it? You know? Guardians.
Other questions or comments from presenters? Professor Keith?
Sure. I want to take the provocative position that from the point of view of climate policy, climate scientists could mostly retire. Now, of course, there's an enormous amount of really exciting work to do on near-term prediction. Just as Gabby said, there's lots more exciting science to do. It's amazing. But in terms of the really big picture things we need to know to make the decisions about cutting emissions, I think it's remarkable how little the science has changed. So I've been working climate science for 30 years, and there's new papers, new excitement. There's stuff that we can do now I would not have guessed, or in fact I guessed that we could not ever do. But I think it's important not to lose sight in all the new science of the big picture that we really know about the large-scale impacts, and that we do not know in a precise way exactly how much the climate will change here or there. And it's tempting to think, wouldn't it be great if we knew all that? But it's not actually obvious we'd be politically better off if we did. It's often easier to make a deal in a situation where we know that generally everybody will be worse off, but we don't know exactly who's the winners and who's the losers, than if you actually did know that. And think about that as Rawls's original position, for those of you who thought about political philosophy. And I think that it really is important to say that, as much as, of course, I'm not actually saying the climate science world should just retire, that with respect to the big decisions we need to make about climate policy, about how we fight politically to cut emissions, I think their job is mostly done.
I know Dr. Ghosh has a question. Dr. Liverman, were you going to respond to what Dr. Keith just said? Or
I'll do it really briefly, which is, there's one question I really want to know the answer to, which has to do with adaptation, and I don't know if it would have been the one I asked Gabby, which is, if we're going to continue to increase temperature, supposing we go to 3.5, and then we do policy acts fast enough and we bring emissions down, one of the questions that's been keeping me up at night is how long does that temperature stay high before it comes down? And also, will the ice ever refreeze, and will the sea level drop down? And so that, I don't know if there's enough papers on that, what I call the sort of overshoot scenario and surviving it. I don't know if you have a comment on that, because that would be the disagreement I would have with David, is I haven't seen you tell us that yet.
Yeah, I didn't talk about the overshoot scenarios, but that is one aspect where we are still doing new things. But I agree with Keith that to make a decision if we need to do something about climate change or not, we know enough. It's still helpful if we can understand more what's coming for adaptation, and it will be important to know that. And it will also be important to know how far we will overshoot and how long it takes to get it down, and where the tipping points are, where you can't get it back. Like if we know that if we melt the Greenland ice sheet, we would have to make it a lot colder to get it back, because then when you expose dark land, the whole area would become much warmer. But that's an extreme case, and it's something that I don't even want to contemplate. But there could be smaller scale issues like that buried somewhere.
Right, so just to add a little bit, the long-term commitment becomes real, and it becomes really important. If we bring the temperature back down fast enough, the usual modeling is that Greenland's ice will survive. If we wait too long, it won't. Because it gets harder and harder to grow it back as it gets thinner and thinner. The frozen ground that we thaw will probably refreeze. The sea ice will probably grow back without too much hysteresis, too much delay. It's sort of, you make it colder and the ocean will freeze again. West Antarctica's ice, if we dump it, will be a very long time coming back. And so there are pieces of this that are essentially irreversible. They're not. West Antarctica's ice grew. It will grow back, but not on human timescales. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Dr. Ghosh.
Oh, well, I think I speak for everyone here when I say that, Sheila, your talk was so incredibly moving, and in so many ways really just went to the heart of everything that is so important about the current crisis. But in relation to the geopolitics of climate change, one thing I think we need to notice is that even if they were not looking at the Arctic as a source of resources, there is still a very important geopolitical incentive for China and Russia to open up the polar route, simply because it allows them to escape the Anglo-American hold on the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. So that's one of the reasons why they're pushing so hard over there. The second thing I wanted to say is that, I was so moved by this, what you said. We can't think our way out of this crisis. We have to feel our way out of this crisis. Can we really even begin to address the significance of that in a system of knowledge where thinking and feeling are completely opposed, where the fundamental sort of basis of this system of knowledge is one where, the idea of objectivity is conceived of as the suppression of feeling, the exclusion of feeling. So when we look at this crisis, the one thing we do know is that we will never know enough. I mean, that is exactly what has been demonstrated, really, by, 200 years of science, if you like, that we will never know enough. And that, in fact, there is no way around, as you say, feeling, to understand, what it is that we want, in the sense of emotions, in the sense of an aspiration. What do you think? Do you think we could ever get there?
I don't think I'd be sitting here if I didn't think we could. It's a long process, long travels to go away and have these kinds of settings, but I have enough hope in the audiences that I speak to because of that connection and that resonance of truth that I get that feedback. I get sustained by that connection. And I don't think it's me speaking from the head that makes that connection. I think it's the heart-to-heart issues that I speak to as our common humanity, our human spirit, our common spirit. So I think we will very slowly get there, but I think, again, I go back to the younger generation that are not mired in the politics, that are thinking differently and feeling differently about these issues. And that's where the hope is. I mean, you look at Greta Thunberg and the movement that she's created. By the way, it's announced, as it came in through my email today, she has won the Right Livelihood Award in Sweden, one of the three. And so there's a resonance there that continues to happen. And so I think so. I think it is going to be, because we live in a world where we have turned a blind eye to so many issues that are impacting those that are marginalized, and those are the most challenged in the world. And so I think it is that disconnect with one another, disconnect to all kinds of issues that we are dealing with this issue in a very heady way, in a very political way, without really humanizing these issues. And so my hope is always supported by the actual connections that are made around the world in the talks that I give. And that's what drives me to keep doing what I do, because I think there is that sense of hope. We are in a world that I think really just others one another way too much. And we have a hard time understanding with compassion when we say, this is what's happening in our communities. You know, we don't get that. We go into negotiations in the global, and we heard that from our own scientists, how difficult it is to be negotiating these kinds of treaties. And I've been to several of these COP meetings, and there's really sometimes no heartbeat to it. And so, you know, it's to try to bring that feeling into those arenas. That's where the change will really happen in terms of understanding one another rather than othering each other. And bring all these issues from the head to the heart where real change happens. That's where real change happens. And so for me, that is the hope. And I speak to these issues from that place, and it is my hope that it is from that place that we can move forward from feeling these issues about climate change, of not just it being a scientific or a political issue, but one that really involves all of us from that place.
Absolutely.
You know?
We are getting lots of questions from the audience asking, what can we do? More articulate than that, but it comes down to that. What can we do? Dr. Keith?
Tell your politicians you want it fixed. That is the fundamental thing. I've spent much of my career working on the energy system side of this, and there are lots of tools by which we could cut emissions in developed societies quite quickly while maintaining a high standard of life. It will cost money, and that's why it's politically hard, and some people are going to lose. But for this to happen, the thing that we need is for enough people in our society to make this essentially their number one issue. This is not something that will get done on some side deal in Washington. Having a nice agreement at the Conference of the Parties does not make action happen. This is something that costs a couple % of GDP in every big country. This is big money. And to make decisions like that, you need governments with mandates where that is their core thing and where they can come into office making decisions that will move the economy at the level of % GDP. And to do that, they need some good fraction of voters who put it as their number one issue. Doesn't matter what party, but what matters is that people know they will not get your vote unless they are going to make rational, fast action to cut emissions. That is the overwhelming thing. And there is a lot of talk about all these personal, you can look up lists on the internet of all these personal things you can do to somehow change your consumption. Maybe, but maybe those things just distract us from the central aspect, which is making the hard political choices. If you look at the huge environmental successes we've had, not just in the richest democracies, but really in much of the world now, improving air quality, toxics like heavy metals, global ozone, organochlorines like DDT, in all those cases, it was fundamentally a political fight with regulation driving technological change. In none of them did behavioral change play a significant role.
Dr. Alley.
Just to add very briefly, doing nothing about this is a political decision too, and more people will lose.
This is just about voting.
Yes.
I'll say what I said yesterday in the student group that we were in, and Diana, of course, started that by saying, I guess, precisely what David is saying about, you know, vote for the right politicians that are really going to make a difference. And I said, you know, I extended that to say, you yourselves, the younger generation, must move into those leadership roles. When you finish school, whenever the time is right for you, your generation is not mired in politics and all of the rest of it like my generation is. And if you can start from that place of heart, open-mindedness, open-heartedness, understanding these connections of our common humanity, then go for those leadership roles yourselves, and that will be the way in which you can change the world. Absolutely.
Dr. Hegerl.
I agree with all that is said. I think we can still, as individuals, if we make some of those choices, we also have an influence as consumers. It's not the same as an influence a politician has, but it does count. And I think it made a difference with the Montreal Protocol that also people were kind of moving against using the CFCs in their spray cans. And we've seen I think this is a bit more in Europe right now than in North America. They have, for those who have seen the Blue Planet documentary on the plastics, there has been a huge movement towards people just don't feel like they don't need to have a paper cup with a plastic lid anymore as much as they used to. And I think the consumers can influence what happens by making those choices, or putting a solar roof on your house and helps distribution of solar power, and also helps your personal footprint. I think I'm going to get myself an electric car next time, even though I'm slightly concerned about the rare earths or so, but I think it will still be a good thing to do. So making individual choices that reflect your values and that reflect what you think is important does influence politics as well, I think, even if on a small scale.
Dr. Liverman.
So we all seem to have great faith in democracy when we're telling people to vote, but there are billions of people in the world where they really don't feel like they have a vote. And even in this country, we have to hope that the power of citizen votes overcomes the power of money influencing politicians. So whilst voting is good and we really do need to vote, we need to think that we're not the only emitter, and there are parts of the world where it's not the vote that works. It might be social protest, it might be putting yourself in danger, trying to force your government to act. We've had so many environmental activists killed in different parts of the world for trying to protect the planet and their livelihoods, and in that case, the democracy didn't really work for them.
Mm-hmm. Well said. I should have said, be politically active. Voting alone is not all of it. Fight, whether it's by protests or direct action or what have you.
Mm-hmm. But I would add that the personal actions really do matter. Very few people want to be on the bleeding edge. Everybody wants to be on the leading edge. And when you figure out the next company that does the green thing, when you figure out the better way to make things work for individuals, when you build the business, and you make it possible for this transition to be easier, you move it forward. And so there really is a role for you as an individual, doing what you do, as well as the collective actions of talking and voting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Anyone else on the panel want to speak to that who hasn't?
Yeah, I mean, I'd add another perspective. Given that many of the decisions that we face in dealing with such a difficult question like climate change are ones that we're going to disagree over, to me, the most important thing to find our way through that is the nature and the quality of the political institutions that we have, whether in liberal democracies, whether in Chinese centralized authoritarian nations or others. And so something that everybody can do is to find ways of investing and increasing the trust that you and your neighbors, citizens, colleagues might place in the institutions that you have at different scales, whether it's local, whether it's national, whether it's international, in the institutional arrangements that we have for finding ways of deciding what to do when we disagree about what to do.
Yeah.
Because if we just pretend that we're all on the same side, then we're living in a fantasy world. And we need to find mechanisms to find these processes through these political institutions that will enable us to navigate through. And so for me, actually, yesterday we had news in the UK that was very uplifting in the sense that our political institutions worked. In the sense that...
You should explain what happened. Not everybody follows the British views.
In the sense that the executive was held to account by the judiciary. So whether it's paying more attention to national institutions, whether it's finding new mechanisms like citizens' assemblies or citizen juries, I think a lot of these questions actually, for me, come down to that type of a question.
And I should explain, because not all of you follow British politics, that basically the Prime Minister tried to close down Parliament to prevent the sort of Remain anti-Brexit, and the judiciary said that he couldn't do that. And
by 11-0.
Yeah, 11-0. And he had to fly back from his moment in the limelight at the climate summit and go back to work because Parliament's opened again.
A question from the audience. We are presented with two moral claims, that of a climate emergency that demands a technical response and a human rights claim by peoples most affected. If an effective solution disproportionately affects one group of people, how do our panelists think we should resolve the conflict?
And just to observe, this is picking up something that you said the other day, Professor Lieberman, when you said, there will be impacts on people. And Anna asked you the question, and then you followed up today with the observation that John Rawls would tell us we're best off if none of us knows who's going to be most harmed by a solution.
Well, I'll give my one version, which is the effort to create central pools of climate finance, which can help those who are particularly affected by climate change or don't have the funds for adaptation or don't have the funds for mitigation. So there have been estimates made of the amount of money that would be needed to help or incentivize people and also to help people adapt. And it has been part of international agreements. Unfortunately, it's a pathetic amount of money given the scope of the problem. So that is one remedy. The other is the lawsuits, such as the ones that youth are filing, because that's another way to get some sort of reparation or repair. So those would be two that maybe might balance winners or losers, but perhaps others have other ideas.
I mean, this is a very, very difficult question. I think it has to be done in very close collaboration, cooperation, listening to and acting on the demands of those who are most hurt, right? We cannot just do an economic optimization and then throw some money at people who were the losers. I think that this has to be a discussion that starts with the people who are losers and moves out from there.
I think when we filed the human rights petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, we were very cautious as Inuit not to make it a lawsuit because we didn't want to see it as money, that we were just after money. It was on moral ground that we really wanted, it was a way of reaching out, as I was saying, it was an act of generosity from the Inuit hunters to teach the world about what we were going through and the traditional knowledge of it. It was reaching out, not striking out. But in a sense, it was a way to get America to start to look at these issues from that perspective. So, I mean, going through the justice systems, of course, you need to have, we couldn't move forward once the Inter-American Commission denied us the true hearing about it because we just didn't have the resources and the money to even move it forward beyond that. But again, it's a tough one. It's a really tough one for us who are already in those places where we just don't have a big pool of resources to use to defend our rights in that way, a human rights in that way. But there are others now who are starting to pick up. The youth are starting to pick up. I just received another email this morning talking about the youth that are wanting to join is it the Juliana lawsuit, you know? And I think that's a movement that's going to go. So good for them if they can find the resources and the arm power and all of that around them to move that forward, then that's going to be helpful for the cause.
We have one of those youth here.
Shout out to Nathan. One of the youth who is part of the Juliana lawsuit is a Gustie, so congratulations. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Let me go back to Sila's talk. You talked about learning from the land, and for many of us in this room, we don't know what that means or how we could try to do that here in our lives. Do you have any suggestions for us?
Well, first of all, not everybody has to become a hunter. You don't have to. But there are ways in which you can, and you already are doing it, I'm sure, in your lives. You know, the younger generation, you're out in nature, you're kayaking, you're doing things that allows you to be in touch with your environment, your climate. And so there's already all of those things that are happening around you that perhaps you're just not even aware that are testing you every day. But nature is one of the best teachers in my experience, in my opinion. But you're also, if you're an athlete, you're testing yourself every day. You're becoming stronger by, the obstacles that you're facing in your lives every day, whether you're a sportsman or a fisherman, or you're out there doing nature walks and hikes and testing yourself in that way. And so for us, the character building skills that I talk about really is about that testing of yourself and elevating yourself to another level of awareness and consciousness about yourself. And unfortunately, what happened with us is we went from that to institutional schooling that often separates the character building. It often separates anyone with character in the classroom. And so for us, it's really been a challenge to try to gain that back and bring it back even into institutional schooling. But you can do that wherever you are. It's to be able to test yourself out in nature and let nature teach you what it's like to grow up and have those kinds of building of your tenacity and your commitment and to be bold under pressure. And you can do that through sports as well. I mean, in Canada, we're very big on hockey. And so there are some good pluses to learning about yourself through the athletics as well. So there's many ways that you can do that as a youth. And not just necessarily in a hunting culture, but I speak from that because for us, that's our hunting. Our hunting grounds are our teaching grounds. They are our universities for our young children. And we've already lost so much throughout the process that by losing now the unpredictability of the climate and the conditions of the ice is making it very difficult for traditional knowledge now to be real, where our elders have now started to say, this is what I've taught you and this is what I'm teaching you, I have been taught for millennia or for decades from my own childhood. And they said there's a disclaimer now. However, because of climate change, it is not always going to be that way. You have to be even more vigilant and cautious about what you're doing out there on that ice. So the challenges continue in that way.
Speaking of not always being that way, a question for Dr. Hegerl. What will really happen if we don't do anything about the climate right now? Where will we be in 50 years, say the models?
50 years. So the scenario, we call them scenarios, the hypothesis that we run through the model would be the high one, so that had 4 degrees further warming at the end of the century. So 4 degrees doesn't sound so bad, does it? But the last ice age was about 5 degrees colder than
It sounds
on
worse
average.
in Fahrenheit.
It's
Right.
I need to go
convert
for
it into
Fahrenheit, yes, and I still, right. And I had translated some of my slide numbers into Fahrenheit and then deleted them, not to have too much text. So 7-ish or so. Fahrenheit, 7-ish, and the last ice age is under 10 Fahrenheit, different from today. So it is a huge difference, and there are some changes that I'm particularly concerned about, which, for example, there have been some papers that the Indian subcontinent might experience heat waves where it's dangerous for humans to be outside in parts of India, which is, so it's no longer, it's just going to be hotter and you're going to be a bit more uncomfortable, and it's dangerous. And that is, I think, something that we should really keep in mind, that we are still animals that inhabit this planet just like the other animals, and we have our limitations, and we can't adjust to everything, and some things will, this is for me a very dangerous gamble to go there.
Just I'd add one thing to that, maybe to the question as well. So, you know, Gabby and climate scientists and climate models can help us think about what the climate might be like in 30, 40, 50 years' time. But the world in 30, 40, 50 years' time is going to be very, very different for a whole load of other reasons. And this is what I call climate reductionism. The danger is that we elevate climate as the only or the sole driver of the future, whereas there are many, many other things driven by technologies, some of which will be good, some of which will be bad, some which will produce benefits, and others will produce new risks and hazards. So think about what else is changing. Go back 40 years. Go back to 1980, for those of you who were around in 1980. And just think about how different your life is now compared to how it was 40 years ago. And then think 40 years ahead, accelerate that level of change in terms of new technologies, whether it's around communication technologies, biomedical technologies, nanomaterials, artificial intelligence, robotics, and recognize that all this is changing in a world in which climate, too, is changing. And then you have a better sense of how the future might unfold. But just focusing on climate, just because we got clever people like Gabby to help us to predict climate, does not mean we should forget about everything else that is also changing, that might indeed be much less predictable than the climate.
I totally agree, and we have one issue that is also changing rapidly is biodiversity, for example. So we can't think of climate change as the only issue we are facing, but I think climate change is making a lot of other issues we are facing worse, and I can't see many that it would make better. So it's it complicates lots of things, and biodiversity loss, for example, definitely gets complicated by climate change, and it's going to be made harder to save our diversity with a climate that changes on top of everything else.
Thank you very much, presenters and discussants. We'll break for lunch now.
Sheila, I wanted to give you a copy of my book.
Oh, yes, please. Thank you.
I think we did well by our audience this time.
Okay.